My daughter-in-law tied me to a chair while my son tore up my documents and shouted, "You don't control anything in this house anymore." They thought I would accept it, but when I told them the truth, they begged me for forgiveness. I should have seen it coming. The signs had been there for months, maybe even years. The way Stephanie would roll her eyes when I spoke at family dinners, how Robert's visits became shorter and more mechanical, like he was checking items off a duty list rather than spending time with his mother. The gradual shift in their tone from respectful to dismissive, then from dismissive to openly hostile. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that cold Tuesday morning in November. I was in my kitchen, making my usual cup of tea and sorting through the mail when I heard the front door slam. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway, followed by Stephanie's sharp heels clicking against the hardwood floor I'd polished myself just days before. "Mom, we need to talk," Robert called out, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. I set down my teacup and walked toward the living room.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
My heart already beginning to race. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Robert stood near the fireplace, his face flushed and his hands clenched into fists. Stephanie positioned herself by the doorway, blocking my exit, though I didn't realize her strategic placement at the time. "Sit down," Robert ordered, pointing to my favorite armchair. The command in his voice shocked me. This was my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died, the child I'd worked 2 jobs to put through college. I'd never heard him speak to anyone with such cold authority, let alone to me. "Robert, what's this about?" I asked, remaining standing. I said sit down. His voice rose to a shout that made me flinch. Stephanie moved closer, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her designer purse. "Amanda, we've been discussing your situation, and we're concerned about your mental state." "My mental state?" I looked between them, confusion mixing with a growing sense of dread. "What are you talking about?" "You've been forgetting things," Robert said, his tone now artificially gentle, as if he were speaking to a child. "Last week you couldn't remember what day it was. You've been repeating stories, losing track of conversations. None of that was true. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been. I kept detailed calendars, managed my own finances, read voraciously, and could recall conversations from months ago with perfect clarity. But before I could protest, Stephanie pulled out a manila folder. "We've been documenting incidents," she said, opening the folder to reveal pages of handwritten notes. "Times when you seemed confused, disoriented. We've also spoken to Dr. Matthews. Dr. Matthews was my physician of 30 years. The idea that he would discuss my medical information with anyone, even family, without my explicit consent was absurd. That's impossible. Doctor-patient confidentiality doesn't apply when a patient lacks the mental capacity to make informed decisions," Stephanie interrupted smoothly. "We've already begun the process of having you declared mentally incompetent." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the back of the armchair to steady myself, my knees suddenly weak. "You've done what?" Robert stepped forward, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, uncertain and seeking approval. But it vanished quickly, replaced by cold determination. "Mom, this is for your own good. You can't live alone anymore. You're not capable of making rational decisions." "I'm perfectly capable." "Are you?" Stephanie's voice cut through mine like a blade. "Then explain this." She pulled out a document from her folder. It was a power of attorney form, supposedly signed by me, giving Robert complete control over my finances and medical decisions. The signature looked remarkably like mine, but I had never seen this document before in my life. "I never signed that," I whispered. Robert and Stephanie exchanged a look that chilled me to the bone. It was the look of co-conspirators, of people who had planned this moment down to the smallest detail. "Mom, you signed it last month," Robert said gently. "Dr. Matthews witnessed it. You don't remember because of your condition." Condition. As if forgetting to sign away my entire life was a simple oversight brought on by age-related decline. "This is insane," I said, my voice rising. "I'm not mentally incompetent. I'm not signing anything. And I want you both to leave my house immediately." That's when Stephanie moved. Before I could react, she was behind me, her hands on my shoulders, pushing me down into the chair with surprising strength. "Sit down, Amanda. You're getting agitated, and that's not good for your blood pressure." I tried to stand, but her grip tightened. "Let go of me. You have no right." "We have every right," Robert said, his voice now completely cold. "We're your family. We're trying to help you." Stephanie reached into her purse and pulled out several zip ties, the kind movers use to secure boxes. The sight of them sent ice through my veins. "What are you doing?" I struggled against her grip, but she was younger and stronger, and she had the advantage of surprise. "Keeping you safe," she said, looping the first tie around my wrist and the arm of the chair. "From yourself." The plastic bit into my skin as she tightened it. I pulled frantically, but the tie only cut deeper. "Robert, stop her. This is assault. This is kidnapping." My son stood watching as his wife secured my other wrist to the chair. His face was blank, emotionless, as if he were watching strangers on television rather than his wife restraining his mother. "Robert, please," I begged, tears starting to blur my vision. "I'm your mother. I changed your diapers. I stayed up all night when you had pneumonia. I worked double shifts to pay for your education. How can you let her do this to me?" For just a moment, his composure cracked. I saw uncertainty flicker across his features, a hint of the loving son I'd raised. But Stephanie was there immediately, her hand on his arm, whispering something in his ear that made his face harden again. "This is necessary, Mom," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Stephanie moved to my desk in the corner of the living room and began pulling out documents. Bank statements, insurance papers, the deed to my house, my will, everything I kept in careful, organized files. "What are you doing with those?" I demanded. "Cleaning up your mess," she replied without looking at me. "Your financial records are chaos. Bills unpaid, accounts scattered across multiple banks. It's clear you haven't been managing your affairs properly." That was a lie. My finances were meticulously organized. Every bill was paid on time, every account balanced to the penny. I'd been managing money since I was 18 years old, and I'd never been more careful about it than in recent years. Robert joined her at the desk, and together they began going through my papers. Stephanie held up my will, the one I'd had drafted 5 years ago that left everything to Robert. "This needs to be updated," she said. "Some of the provisions are unclear." "Don't touch that," I said, straining against the zip ties. "Those are my private documents." "Nothing's private when you're not competent to manage it yourself," Stephanie replied. Then she did something that made my heart stop. She tore the will in half. "No!" I screamed, pulling so hard against the restraints that I felt something warm and wet on my wrists. "Blood. That's my will. You have no right." "I have Robert's power of attorney," she said calmly, ripping the document into smaller pieces. "Which means I have every right." Robert picked up other documents, insurance policies, investment statements, certificates of deposit. One by one, he began tearing them up. "You don't control anything in this house anymore," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "Do you understand me? Nothing. You're done making decisions. You're done pretending you know what's best." I watched in horror as 30 years of careful financial planning was destroyed before my eyes. Documents I would need to prove ownership of accounts, policies I'd paid premiums on for decades, records that represented my entire adult life, all of it reduced to confetti scattered across my living room floor. "Please stop," I whispered, my voice hoarse from screaming. "Please." But they didn't stop. They continued their systematic destruction while I sat helpless, bleeding from the plastic restraints, watching my life's work disappear. "The nursing home has an opening," Stephanie said conversationally as she shredded my homeowner's insurance policy. "Sunny Vista Manor. It's not the most expensive, but it's adequate for someone in your condition." "I'm not going to any nursing home," I said. "Yes, you are," Robert said, not looking up from the papers he was destroying. "We've already put a deposit down. You'll be much safer there with trained professionals who can monitor your medication and make sure you don't hurt yourself." The casual way he discussed disposing of me, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than the woman who had given him life, broke something inside me. I'd always known Robert was weak, easily influenced by others, but I'd never imagined he could be this cruel. Your house will need to be sold, of course, Stephanie continued. The proceeds will help pay for your care. What's left over will go toward Robert's business expansion. It's what's best for everyone. What was best for everyone? Not what I wanted, not what I'd worked for, not what I'd planned. What was convenient for them? I closed my eyes and tried to think. Panic wouldn't help me now. I needed to be smart, to remember everything my late husband had taught me about keeping calm under pressure. Charles had been a practical man, a man who believed in contingency plans and protecting what mattered most. When I opened my eyes, I saw them studying a document I hadn't noticed before. It was a real estate listing for my house, already prepared, complete with photographs and a suggested asking price. They had planned this for months, maybe longer. Every detail had been worked out in advance, from the forged power of attorney to the nursing home deposit to the house listing. I wasn't dealing with a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by genuine concern for my welfare. This was a calculated attack designed to strip me of everything I owned and everything I was. But there was something they didn't know. Something I had never told Robert. Something Charles and I had decided to keep secret until the right moment came. The right moment had arrived. I sat in that chair for 3 hours. 3 hours with plastic zip ties cutting into my wrists, watching my son and daughter-in-law methodically dismantle my life. They worked with the efficiency of professional burglars, sorting through my belongings as if I weren't even there. Stephanie had brought moving boxes. That detail hit me harder than almost anything else. She'd come prepared for this. She packed my jewelry, my photo albums, my late husband's war medals. Everything that made this house a home was being erased. "The movers will come for the furniture tomorrow," she said, wrapping my grandmother's china in newspaper. "Most of it won't fit in your new room anyway." My new room. A sterile cell in some institutional building where I'd be warehoused until I died. "I want to call my lawyer," I said for the 10th time. "Your lawyer retired last year," Robert replied without looking up from the box where he was dumping my financial records, the ones he hadn't destroyed. "Besides, in your condition, any legal agreements you try to make would be considered invalid." That was when I realized how thorough their planning had been. They hadn't just forged documents and found a nursing home. They'd researched my support systems, identified potential obstacles, and eliminated them one by one. "When did you speak to Mr. Henderson?" I asked. Theodore Henderson had been my attorney for 15 years. The idea that he would retire without telling me was absurd. "Mom, you're confused again," Robert said in that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "We told you about Mr. Henderson's retirement party. You even signed his farewell card." I had no memory of any farewell party or card, but then again, according to them, I had no memory of signing legal documents either. They were systematically making me doubt my own recollections, building a case for my incompetence with every conversation. Stephanie's phone rang. She answered it with the bright, cheerful voice she reserved for people who might be useful to her. "Hi, Dr. Matthews." "Yes, we're with her now." "I know. It's so sad to see the decline." "No. She's having another episode today. Very agitated and paranoid. Yes, the arrangements are all in place. Tomorrow morning at 10. Thank you so much for your help with this difficult situation." My blood ran cold. Dr. Matthews had been my physician for 30 years. He'd delivered Robert, treated Charles through his final illness, guided me through menopause and beyond. The idea that he would conspire against me was devastating. "What arrangements?" I demanded as Stephanie ended the call. "Dr. Matthews is meeting us at Sunny Vista tomorrow to help with your admission," she said, returning to her packing. "He wants to make sure your transition is as smooth as possible." "I'm not going anywhere with you people." Robert finally looked at me directly. "Mom, you don't have a choice. The papers are already filed. Dr. Matthews has documented your cognitive decline over the past 18 months. You're not competent to refuse treatment." 18 months. That's how long they'd been planning this. While I'd been hosting family dinners and sending birthday cards and babysitting their children, they'd been building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent. "What did you tell Dr. Matthews about me?" I asked. Stephanie pulled out a small notebook and flipped through it. Memory loss, confusion about dates and times, difficulty managing household tasks, inappropriate emotional responses, paranoid ideation. Each item on her list was a lie, but they were believable lies. The kind of symptoms that could be easily fabricated and impossible to disprove, especially when presented by concerned family members to a busy doctor who had known them for years. "You've been documenting fake symptoms," I said. "We've been documenting our genuine concerns," Robert corrected. "Like last month when you called me 3 times in one day asking the same question." I had called him 3 times in one day. But not because I'd forgotten our previous conversations. I'd called because he kept giving me evasive answers about why he couldn't attend my birthday dinner. And I'd sensed he was lying to me. I'd been trying to pin him down on a commitment, not repeating myself due to memory loss. But that's not how they would present it to Dr. Matthews or anyone else. They'd taken normal interactions and reframed them as evidence of cognitive decline. "The neighbors have been worried too," Stephanie added. "Mrs. Chen mentioned that you seemed confused when she saw you at the grocery store last week." Mrs. Chen lived next door and had been my friend for over a decade. The idea that she would discuss my mental state with Stephanie seemed unlikely, but I couldn't be certain. Stephanie had a way of making people feel like they were being helpful when they shared information about others. "What did Mrs. Chen say?" I asked. "That you were in the cereal aisle for over 20 minutes just staring at the boxes. She had to ask if you were okay." I remembered that trip to the grocery store. I'd been comparing prices and reading nutritional labels, trying to decide between 2 brands of oatmeal. It had taken me a while because I was being thorough, not because I was confused. But a neighbor witnessing that behavior could easily misinterpret it as cognitive impairment, especially if prompted to do so by a concerned family member. "You've been poisoning people against me," I said. "We've been sharing our concerns with people who care about you," Robert replied. "Everyone can see the changes, Mom. You're just too proud to admit you need help." The systematic nature of their campaign was becoming clear. They hadn't just decided one day to have me committed. They'd spent months, maybe longer, planting seeds of doubt about my mental capacity with everyone in my life. My doctor, my neighbors, probably my few remaining friends. "What about Susan?" I asked, thinking of my closest friend. "Does she think I'm losing my mind too?" Another look passed between Robert and Stephanie. "Mom, Susan moved to Florida 6 months ago. Don't you remember? We helped her pack." I felt the room spin slightly. Susan hadn't moved to Florida. We'd had lunch together just 2 weeks ago. She'd told me about her grandson's college graduation and her plans to redecorate her kitchen. There was no way she had moved to Florida without my knowing it. Unless she had, and I'd somehow forgotten or blocked it out. Unless my memory really was failing, and I was too proud or too frightened to acknowledge it. No. I forced myself to think clearly. Susan lived on Maple Street in the blue house with white shutters. She drove a silver Honda Civic with a St. Christopher medal hanging from the rearview mirror. She was allergic to shellfish and took medication for high blood pressure. She volunteered at the animal shelter on Tuesday mornings and played bridge every Thursday afternoon. If I were losing my memory, would I remember all those details about my friend? Would I be able to recall our recent conversation about her grandson's major in engineering and her concerns about his girlfriend's spending habits? "Susan didn't move to Florida," I said firmly. "Mom, we drove you to the airport to say goodbye," Robert said gently. "You cried. It was very emotional, but I could see something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that told me he was lying. They hadn't counted on my challenging this particular fabrication. They'd assumed I would accept their version of events like I'd been accepting everything else. "If Susan moved to Florida, what's her new address?" I asked. "We have it somewhere," Stephanie said vaguely. "I'll get it for you later." "Call her," I demanded. "Call her right now and let me talk to her." "Mom, you're getting agitated again," Robert said. This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior Dr. Matthews is concerned about. Paranoid behavior. They had an answer for everything, a medical explanation for every reasonable question I asked. If I challenged their lies, I was being paranoid. If I forgot details they claimed had happened, I was showing signs of dementia. If I remembered things they said I should have forgotten, I was confusing past and present. It was a perfect trap. Any response I gave could be interpreted as evidence of my mental decline. "I want to see the papers you filed," I said. "The ones claiming I'm mentally incompetent." "You wouldn't understand them," Stephanie said dismissively. "They're full of legal and medical terminology. I have a college degree and 40 years of experience managing my own affairs. I think I can handle some paperwork." "That's just it, Mom," Robert said. "You haven't been managing your affairs properly. Your checkbook is a mess. Your bills are piling up. You've been making poor financial decisions." More lies. My checkbook was balanced to the penny. My bills were paid automatically from my checking account, and I reviewed every statement carefully. I hadn't made any major financial decisions in years beyond normal household expenses and regular investments. But they were creating a narrative, building a case that would be difficult to challenge once it was officially documented. A story about a once competent woman whose mind was failing, whose family had reluctantly stepped in to protect her from herself. "Show me my checkbook," I said. "Show me these bills you claim are piling up." Stephanie reached into one of her boxes and pulled out my checkbook. She opened it and held it toward me, and I felt my heart sink. The register was a disaster. Entries written in different handwriting, numbers that didn't add up, deposits and withdrawals that made no sense. It looked like the work of someone whose grip on reality was slipping. But it wasn't my handwriting. Someone had taken my carefully maintained records and altered them, or replaced them entirely with fake entries designed to support their case. "That's not my checkbook," I said. "Mom, you wrote these entries," Robert said. "Look, here's your signature on every check." The signatures did look like mine. Close enough to fool a casual observer, but not quite right. The A in Amanda was too angular. The loop in the D too small. Someone had practiced forging my signature, probably for weeks or months. "You changed it," I said. "You or Stephanie took my real checkbook and replaced it with this fake one." "Why would we do that?" Stephanie asked, her voice full of hurt innocence. "Why would we want to make you look incompetent?" The answer to that question was sitting all around us in moving boxes. They wanted my house, my savings, my investments. They wanted everything I'd worked for my entire adult life, and the easiest way to get it was to have me declared mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. "Money," I said simply. "You're doing this for money." Robert's face flushed red. "How can you say that? After everything we've done for you, all the times we've helped you when you were confused or scared." But I wasn't confused or scared. Not until today. Until this morning, I'd been living independently, managing my own household, maintaining friendships, reading books, following current events, making rational decisions about my daily life. The only thing that had changed was their behavior toward me. The gradual shift from respectful to dismissive, the increasing frequency of visits accompanied by questions about my finances, the subtle suggestions that I might be happier in a community with people my own age. They'd been preparing me for this day, softening me up, making me doubt myself so that when the moment came, I'd be easier to control. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their planning. They'd assumed I was helpless, that Charles and I had been naive about the dangers facing elderly people with assets worth protecting. They were wrong. By evening, they had finished their systematic destruction of my life. The living room looked like a crime scene, with torn documents scattered across the floor and boxes stacked against every wall. My home of 35 years had been reduced to inventory items waiting for disposal. Stephanie cut the zip ties around my wrists with kitchen scissors, but only after Robert positioned himself behind my chair. They weren't taking any chances that I might try to run or fight back. "We're going to make you some dinner," Stephanie announced, as if this were a normal family visit. "Then you should get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a big day." My wrists were raw and bleeding where the plastic had cut into my skin. I rubbed them gently, trying to restore circulation while my mind raced through possibilities. They clearly intended to keep me here overnight, probably taking shifts to watch me. In the morning, they'd load me into a car and drive me to Sunny Vista Manor, where Dr. Matthews would be waiting to sign whatever papers were needed to make my imprisonment official. Unless I could find a way to stop them. "I need to use the bathroom," I said. "Of course," Robert replied, but he followed me down the hallway and waited outside the door. I could hear his breathing on the other side of the thin wood, could see his shadow blocking the light from the hallway fixture. In the bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror for the first time since this nightmare began. My gray hair was disheveled, my blouse wrinkled and stained with blood from my wrists. I looked exactly like what they wanted me to appear to be, a confused, fragile old woman who couldn't take care of herself. But my eyes were clear and focused. My hands were steady. My mind was working with crystalline precision, analyzing every detail of their plan and searching for weaknesses. The bathroom window was too small to climb through, and even if I could manage it, Robert would hear me trying to open it. The front and back doors were surely being watched. My phone was in my purse, which Stephanie had confiscated along with my car keys and wallet. I was trapped, but not helpless. Not yet. When I emerged from the bathroom, I found them in the kitchen. Stephanie was heating a can of soup on my stove, while Robert sat at my table, scrolling through his phone. They looked remarkably calm for two people who had just committed multiple felonies. "Chicken noodle," Stephanie said brightly, as if she were doing me a favor. "Your favorite." It wasn't my favorite. She'd never bothered to learn what I actually liked to eat. But I nodded and sat down at the table across from Robert, studying his face. He avoided meeting my eyes, focusing instead on his phone screen. "What are you looking at?" I asked. "Real estate listings?" he replied without thinking, then caught himself. I'm checking emails. Work stuff." But I'd seen the screen before he tilted it away from me. He was indeed looking at real estate listings, for houses in expensive neighborhoods, properties well beyond what his salary as a middle manager could afford. Unless he had access to additional funds, like the proceeds from selling my house. "Find anything interesting?" I asked. "Just work," he repeated, but his ears had turned red the way they used to when he was a child telling lies. Stephanie placed a bowl of soup in front of me and sat down with her own bowl. We ate in uncomfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against ceramic and the occasional buzz of Robert's phone. I forced myself to eat, even though my stomach was churning. I needed to maintain my strength for whatever was coming. As I ate, I watched them both carefully, noting their body language, their facial expressions, the way they communicated with glances and subtle gestures. They were nervous. Beneath their confident exterior, they were anxious about something. Maybe they were worried about legal consequences if their plan backfired. Maybe they were concerned that someone would question the sudden appearance of dementia in a woman who had shown no previous signs of cognitive decline. Or maybe they were afraid I would find a way to fight back. After dinner, Stephanie announced that she would take the first watch while Robert went home to handle some business. The idea that my own son would leave me alone with his wife, tied up like a criminal, was almost as devastating as everything else that had happened. "I'll be back in a few hours," Robert said, kissing Stephanie goodbye. He paused at the kitchen doorway and looked back at me, and for just a moment I saw a flicker of the boy I'd raised. "Try to get some rest, Mom. Tomorrow will be easier if you don't fight it." After he left, Stephanie moved me back to the living room chair and secured my wrists again, though she used softer fabric ties this time instead of the plastic zip ties. "Small mercy. This doesn't have to be unpleasant," she said, settling into my husband's old recliner with a magazine. "If you cooperate, we can make sure you're placed in a nice facility. The state-run places are less comfortable." The threat was clear. Behave yourself, or we'll warehouse you somewhere truly horrible. "Why?" I asked. "Why are you doing this to me?" She looked up from her magazine with genuine surprise. "I'm not doing anything to you, Amanda. I'm helping you. You need professional care, and Robert and I are making sure you get it. You're stealing my house. We're managing your assets responsibly. The house is too big for one person, especially someone in your condition. The money from the sale will pay for your care. What's left over goes to Robert's business expansion." She smiled then, a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. Robert works very hard. He deserves to benefit from his family's resources. His family's resources, not my resources, earned through decades of careful saving and wise investing. His resources, by virtue of being my son, and therefore entitled to everything I owned. I worked for 40 years to build what I have, I said. I raised Robert alone after his father died. I put him through college, helped him buy his first house, gave him everything I could afford to give. And this is how he repays me? You raised him, yes. And now it's his turn to take care of you. That's how families work. Taking care of me doesn't mean stealing from me. It's not stealing when it's legally transferred through proper channels, she replied, returning to her magazine. Everything we're doing is completely above board. Legal didn't mean ethical. Forging signatures, falsifying medical records, and having someone committed based on manufactured evidence might be technically possible within the system, but it was still fraud, still abuse, still theft. But fighting them on legal grounds would require resources I no longer had access to. My lawyer had supposedly retired. My bank accounts would soon be frozen. My house would be sold. Even if I could prove their deception, it would take months or years to work through the courts, and by then, I'd be trapped in an institution, drugged into compliance, my credibility destroyed by official diagnoses of dementia. I needed a different strategy, something they wouldn't expect, something they couldn't prepare for or defend against. So I began to play a role. I let my head droop forward as if I were falling asleep. I made my breathing slower and deeper. I let my body relax in the chair, appearing to surrender to exhaustion and defeat. Stephanie glanced at me occasionally, but after an hour of my apparent unconsciousness, she became absorbed in her magazine. The house settled into quiet, broken only by the tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional turn of a page. But I wasn't sleeping. Behind my closed eyelids, my mind was working furiously, remembering conversations Charles and I had shared in the years before his death, plans we'd made, precautions we'd taken, secrets we'd decided to keep until they became necessary. Charles had been a careful man, a man who understood that having money made you a target. He'd grown up poor and worked his way to modest wealth through decades of disciplined saving and conservative investing. But he'd also seen what happened to elderly people whose families viewed them as obstacles standing between them and inheritances. Never let them see everything you have, he'd told me during one of our late-night conversations. Keep something in reserve, something they don't know about. I'd thought he was being paranoid at the time. Robert was a good boy, I'd argued. He would never hurt me or take advantage of me. Charles had smiled sadly and squeezed my hand. I hope you're right, he'd said. But if you're wrong, you'll need protection they can't take away. Charles had been right. My trusting nature had blinded me to Robert's true character, or perhaps Robert had changed over the years, corrupted by Stephanie's influence and his own growing sense of entitlement. Either way, the protection Charles had insisted on was about to become essential. After 2 hours of pretending to sleep, I heard a car in the driveway. Robert had returned, and I could hear him talking quietly with Stephanie in the kitchen. They were discussing logistics for the morning, what time to leave, which route to take, what to do if the nursing home had questions about my condition. She seems pretty out of it, Stephanie was saying. I don't think she'll give us much trouble. Good, Robert replied. I was worried she might try to run or call someone. Her phone is locked in my car, and I have her house keys. She's not going anywhere. They talked for a few more minutes, then Robert came into the living room to check on me. I kept my breathing steady and my body relaxed, giving every appearance of deep sleep. He stood there for a long moment, studying my face. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. I know you won't understand, but this really is for the best. Then he went upstairs to sleep in my guest bedroom while Stephanie settled onto the couch to keep watch. Within an hour, I could hear Robert's snores from upstairs and Stephanie's deeper breathing from the living room. They both thought I was helpless, a confused old woman who had given up, who would meekly accept whatever fate they had planned for her. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Charles and I had spent years preparing for this exact scenario. and tomorrow morning they would discover that Amanda Hartwell was not the easy victim they thought she was. But first, I needed to make a phone call. At 3 in the morning, when both Robert and Stephanie were deeply asleep, I began working on the fabric ties around my wrists. They were softer than the zip ties, but still tight enough to restrict my movement. However, fabric had more give than plastic, and after 30 minutes of patient twisting and pulling, I managed to loosen them enough to slip one hand free. I sat perfectly still for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the house. Robert's snores continued from upstairs. Stephanie's breathing remained deep and regular from the couch. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the seconds with mechanical precision. Slowly, carefully, I freed my other hand and stood up from the chair. My legs were stiff from hours of sitting, and I had to grip the armrest to steady myself. Every movement had to be deliberate and silent. The phone I needed wasn't my cell phone, which Stephanie had confiscated. It was the old landline in Charles's study, a room they hadn't bothered to search because they assumed I was too feeble to use it for anything important. The study was at the back of the house, behind the kitchen, and the door had been closed all day. I crept through the living room, stepping carefully around the scattered boxes and torn documents. The hardwood floors creaked occasionally, old wood settling in the night. But the sounds were familiar and didn't seem to disturb my captors. The study door opened silently on well-oiled hinges. I slipped inside and closed it behind me, then felt my way through the darkness to Charles's old desk. The phone sat exactly where it had for the past 5 years, untouched since his death except for my weekly dusting. I lifted the receiver and dialed a number I'd memorized years ago but never expected to use. It rang twice before a professional voice answered. "Blackstone Security Services, emergency line. This is Amanda Hartwell," I whispered. "Access code 7792. There was a pause, then the sound of computer keys clicking. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is David Chen. Are you in immediate physical danger?" "Yes," I replied. "They've tied me up. They're planning to have me committed tomorrow morning based on forged documents." "Understood. Are you at your primary residence?" "Yes." "How many subjects are we dealing with?" "2. My son Robert and his wife Stephanie. Robert is asleep upstairs. Stephanie is in the living room. Are they armed?" I thought about that. I hadn't seen any weapons, but I couldn't be certain. "I don't know. We'll assume they are. Mrs. Hartwell, I need you to return to your previous position and wait. Our team will be there in 20 minutes. Do not attempt to leave the house or confront the subjects yourself." "Understood. One more thing. Is the safe word still Charles?" "Yes." "Good. Help is coming." I hung up the phone and made my way back through the dark house to the living room chair. Working the fabric ties back around my wrists was more difficult than loosening them had been, but I managed to make it look like I'd never moved. Then I settled back into the chair and waited. Blackstone Security Services had been Charles's idea, implemented during the last year of his life when his illness had made him particularly aware of mortality and vulnerability. They specialized in protecting elderly clients from financial abuse, providing everything from background checks on caregivers to emergency intervention in cases of family fraud. "It's like insurance," Charles had explained when he first contracted their services. "You hope you'll never need it, but if you do, you'll be grateful it's there." The monthly retainer had seemed like an unnecessary expense at the time. Charles was paranoid about money, I'd thought, seeing threats where none existed. But he'd insisted, and after his death, I'd continued the payments out of respect for his wishes, rather than any belief that I'd ever need their services. Now, sitting in that chair with my wrists bound and my life being stolen piece by piece, I was grateful for Charles's paranoia. 18 minutes later, I heard a soft sound at the front door. Not a knock or a doorbell, but the almost inaudible click of professional lockpicks at work. Stephanie stirred on the couch but didn't wake. The sounds were too subtle to penetrate deep sleep. The door opened silently, and 3 figures dressed in black tactical gear slipped into the house. They moved like shadows, each one taking a predetermined position. One headed for the stairs, one positioned himself near the kitchen doorway, and the third approached the living room where Stephanie slept. The man near Stephanie made a small hand signal, and suddenly lights blazed throughout the house. All 3 operatives shouted simultaneously, "Security! Nobody move!" Stephanie jerked awake, confused and terrified. She tried to sit up, but found herself facing a man in tactical gear with security emblazoned across his vest. "Hands where I can see them," he commanded. "Do not reach for anything." From upstairs came the sound of Robert stumbling out of bed, his voice thick with sleep and panic. "What's happening? Who's there?" "Stay where you are," called the operative on the stairs. "Come down slowly with your hands visible." Robert appeared at the top of the stairs in his underwear, hands raised, eyes wide with shock. "I don't understand. What's going on?" The team leader, who I now recognized as David Chen from our phone conversation, approached my chair. He was a compact man in his 40s with intelligent eyes and steady hands. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, using the safe word. "Charles." "Charles," I replied, confirming my identity. He immediately began cutting the fabric ties around my wrists. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm all right," I said, though my voice was shaking with relief. "They destroyed my documents and forged legal papers. They were planning to have me committed this morning." David nodded grimly. "We'll need to document everything." "Richardson, start photographing the scene." One of the other operatives began taking pictures of the torn documents scattered across the floor, the moving boxes, my bleeding wrists, and the fabric ties that had restrained me. "This is ridiculous," Stephanie said, finding her voice. "We're Amanda's family. We're trying to help her. She's confused and paranoid." "Ma'am, please remain seated," David replied without looking at her. "We'll get to you in a moment." Robert had made it down the stairs and was staring at the scene in disbelief. "Mom, who are these people? How did you call them?" "They're my security team," I said, standing up from the chair for the first time in hours. "Something your father arranged before he died." The expression on Robert's face was almost comical. He'd never known about Blackstone Security, had never suspected that his mild-mannered father had taken steps to protect his widow from exactly this kind of abuse. "Security team?" Stephanie's voice rose to a near shriek. "You hired mercenaries to attack your own family." "I hired professionals to protect me from criminals," I corrected, which, as it turns out, was necessary. David had finished documenting my injuries and was now examining the scattered papers on the floor. He picked up pieces of my torn will and photographed them, then moved on to the forged power of attorney documents. "Mrs. Hartwell, have you seen these power of attorney papers before?" "Never. The signature is forged." "We'll have our document experts verify that." He turned to Robert and Stephanie. "I need to see identification from both of you." "We don't have to show you anything," Stephanie snapped. "You're not police officers." "No, ma'am, we're not. But we are licensed security professionals responding to a client's emergency call, and we're documenting evidence of what appears to be elder abuse, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment." The word imprisonment hit Robert like a physical blow. "We weren't imprisoning her. We were trying to help her." "By tying her to a chair?" David asked mildly. "She was agitated. We were keeping her safe." "From what?" Robert looked around helplessly, realizing that his justification sounded absurd when questioned by a professional. "From herself. She's not thinking clearly." "Mrs. Hartwell seems perfectly lucid to me," David observed. "She was able to provide correct access codes, explain her situation coherently, and give accurate information about the layout of her house and the location of the subjects." While David questioned Robert and Stephanie, the other two operatives continued documenting evidence. They photographed the forged checkbook, the fake medical records, the moving boxes full of my belongings. They took pictures of my injuries and the restraints that had been used. "Mrs. Hartwell," David said, "we need to discuss your immediate safety. Do you feel secure remaining in this house tonight?" I looked at Robert and Stephanie, both of whom were staring at me with expressions of shock and growing fear. The confident criminals who had tied me to a chair and destroyed my documents were gone, replaced by two people who were beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. "I think I'll be fine now," I said. "But I want them out of my house." "You can't throw us out," Stephanie protested. "We live here too." "Actually, you don't," I replied calmly. "This house is in my name, and you're trespassing. Mr. Chen, can you escort them off my property?" "It would be my pleasure," David said. "Mr. and Mrs." He waited for them to provide their names. "Hartwell," Robert said reluctantly. I'm her son. And you, ma'am? Stephanie Hartwell. David made notes in a small pad. Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, you need to leave this property immediately. You may not return without Mrs. Hartwell's express permission or a court order. This is insane, Stephanie said, but she was already moving toward the door. Amanda, you're making a terrible mistake. You need our help. What I need, I said, is never to see either of you again. Robert paused at the door, looking back at me with something that might have been regret. Mom, I'm sorry things got out of hand. We really were trying to do what's best. No, Robert, I said quietly. You were trying to do what's best for you. There's a difference. After they left, David and his team spent another hour documenting everything and helping me secure the house. They changed the locks, installed additional security cameras, and gave me direct contact numbers for emergency response. Mrs. Hartwell, David said as they prepared to leave, this won't be over. They'll likely try to pursue legal action, claim you're mentally incompetent, attempt to have you committed through official channels. Let them try, I said. I have resources they don't know about. David smiled. Your husband was a very thorough man. He anticipated this exact scenario. Yes, he was. And tomorrow, Robert and Stephanie are going to learn just how thorough. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, I sat in Charles's study, surrounded by the evidence of Robert and Stephanie's crimes, waiting for morning to arrive. At exactly 8 o'clock, I made the phone call I'd been anticipating for years. Wellington and Associates, came the crisp professional voice. This is Amanda Hartwell. I need to speak with Thomas Wellington immediately. One moment, please. Thomas had been Charles's closest friend and business partner for over 30 years. More importantly, he was the lawyer who had helped us create what Charles called our nuclear option, a legal strategy so comprehensive and devastating that we'd hoped never to use it. Amanda, Thomas's warm voice came through the phone. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. David Chen called me an hour ago. Then you know what happened. I know enough. Are you ready to proceed with Charles's plan? I looked around the study, at the photographs of Charles and me taken during happier times, at the bookshelves lined with his favorite legal texts and philosophy books. Charles had spent the last 2 years of his life creating an intricate web of legal protections, convinced that Robert would eventually reveal his true nature. I'm ready, I said. Good. I'll be there in 30 minutes. And Amanda? Charles would be proud of how you handled this. After I hung up, I walked through my house, really seeing it for the first time since yesterday's nightmare began. The moving boxes were still stacked against the walls, my belongings sorted and labeled for disposal. But now, instead of evidence of my defeat, they looked like monuments to Robert and Stephanie's arrogance. They'd been so confident in their plan, so certain that I was helpless and alone, they'd never imagined that Charles had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario, creating layers of protection that went far beyond a simple security service. Thomas arrived precisely on time, carrying the same battered leather briefcase he'd used for as long as I'd known him. He was 72 years old, but moved with the energy of a much younger man, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. You look well for someone who was tied to a chair yesterday, he said, embracing me gently. I feel better than I have in months, maybe years. Good. Because what we're about to do will change everything. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, the same kind Charles used to bring home from his office, but this one was labeled with my name and marked confidential, to be opened only upon implementation of emergency protocols. Charles spent 2 years creating this, Thomas said, setting the folder on the desk. He was convinced that Robert had the potential for this kind of behavior, and he wanted to make sure you were protected. I never believed him. I thought he was being paranoid. Charles understood human nature better than most people. He saw the signs that you missed because you loved Robert too much to see them clearly. Thomas opened the folder and pulled out the first document. It was a comprehensive investigation report on Robert and Stephanie, complete with financial records, employment history, and personal background information. Charles hired private investigators to look into both of them, Thomas explained. What they found was illuminating. I read through the report with growing horror. Robert had been lying to me for years about almost everything. His supposed success at work was fiction. He'd been passed over for promotion 3 times and was barely meeting his sales quotas. The modest house I thought they lived in was actually rented, not owned. Their financial situation was desperate. But Stephanie's background was even more disturbing. She'd been married twice before Robert, both times to older men with substantial assets. Her first husband had died in a suspicious car accident just months after changing his will to leave everything to her. Her second husband had been committed to a psychiatric facility after being declared mentally incompetent, and Stephanie had gained control of his finances through a power of attorney. "She's done this before," I whispered, "twice, and she was preparing to do it again, using Robert as her accomplice." Thomas pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the state attorney general's office. Charles also discovered that Stephanie was under investigation for elder abuse in connection with her second husband's case. The investigation was closed when the husband died, but the evidence is still on file. My hands shook as I read the official report. Stephanie wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law trying to steal her mother-in-law's money. She was a predator who had made a career of targeting vulnerable elderly people. "There's more," Thomas said grimly. He pulled out a bank statement that made my blood run cold. It was from an account I'd never seen before, opened 3 months ago in Robert's name. The deposits showed regular transfers from various sources, including several from accounts that belonged to elderly clients of the financial planning firm where Stephanie worked. "She's been stealing from her employer's clients," I said, "and using Robert to help launder the money. He may not have known the full extent of what she was doing, but he was certainly complicit." I sank into Charles's old chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. My son wasn't just a weak man manipulated by his wife. He was an active participant in a criminal enterprise that had been victimizing elderly people for years. "What do we do with this information?" I asked. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw real satisfaction in someone's expression. "We destroy them," he said simply. "Completely and legally." He pulled out the final document from the folder, a legal brief that was nearly 50 pages long. The title page read, "Criminal Referral and Civil Action, The People versus Robert Hartwell and Stephanie Hartwell." Charles worked with federal investigators for 18 months, building an airtight case against both of them. The evidence includes financial fraud, elder abuse, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The federal charges alone carry a potential sentence of 20 to 30 years in prison. I stared at the document, hardly able to process what I was reading. Charles had not only anticipated Robert and Stephanie's attack on me, he'd prepared a counterattack so comprehensive that it would destroy them both. "When does this get filed?" I asked. "Today. I've already spoken with the federal prosecutor's office. They've been waiting for Robert and Stephanie to make their move so they could add attempted elder abuse and unlawful imprisonment to the charges. And the civil case? That's even better. Charles created a trust structure that protects all of your assets while allowing us to sue them for every penny they've stolen, plus punitive damages. By the time we're finished, they'll be bankrupt as well as imprisoned." I thought about Robert standing in my living room just 12 hours ago, confidently destroying my documents and shouting that I didn't control anything anymore. He'd been so certain that he held all the power that I was helpless to stop him. "There's one more thing," Thomas said. "Charles wanted you to have this." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Charles's familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 3 months before his death. "My dearest Amanda," it began. "If you're reading this, then my worst fears about Robert have been realized. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this pain, but I hope the measures I've taken will give you the justice you deserve. You are stronger than you know, and you deserve better than the son we raised. Be ruthless in your response. They certainly were in their attack on you. All my love, Charles." Tears blurred my vision as I finished reading. Even in death, Charles was still protecting me, still planning 3 steps ahead of anyone who might try to hurt me. "When will they be arrested?" I asked. Thomas checked his watch. "The federal marshals should be executing the warrants right about now." As if summoned by his words, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Robert's number. "Answer it," Thomas advised, "but put it on speaker." I pressed the button and Robert's panicked voice filled the room. "Mom, you have to help me. The FBI is here. They're arresting me and Stephanie. They're saying we stole money from elderly people. This is insane. You have to tell them this is all a misunderstanding." I looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "Robert," I said calmly, "this isn't a misunderstanding. This is justice. What are you talking about? Mom, please, I'm your son. You can't let them do this to me. You stopped being my son the moment you tied me to that chair," I replied. "You made your choice, Robert. Now you get to live with the consequences." "But Mom?" I hung up the phone and turned to Thomas. "How do you feel?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. Yesterday, I'd been a victim, helpless and alone, facing the prospect of being imprisoned in a nursing home while my life's work was stolen from me. Today, I was a woman in complete control of her destiny, watching justice unfold exactly as my beloved husband had planned. "I feel free," I said finally. "For the first time in years, I feel completely free." 6 months later, I sat in my garden on a perfect spring morning, reading the newspaper with my coffee and watching the roses Charles had planted years ago bloom in brilliant reds and whites. The house was quiet, peaceful, exactly as it should be. The newspaper contained a small item on page 6 that most readers would skip over entirely. Local couple sentenced in elder fraud case. Robert had received 12 years in federal prison. Stephanie got 18 years, her previous pattern of targeting elderly victims having been taken into account during sentencing. I folded the newspaper and set it aside. Their fate no longer consumed my thoughts the way it had in the immediate aftermath of their arrest. Justice had been served, thoroughly and completely, and I had moved on to more important things. The garden, for instance. I'd spent the winter months planning extensive renovations, and now the space was being transformed into something that reflected my own tastes, rather than compromises made with Charles decades ago. Not that I didn't love what we'd created together, but it was time for new growth. "Mrs. Hartwell?" I looked up to see Emma, the young woman who'd been helping me with the garden work. She was 25, a graduate student in landscape architecture who'd answered my newspaper ad with enthusiasm and skill that reminded me of myself at that age. "The roses you ordered for the back border arrived," she said. "Should we plant them today?" "Absolutely. The sooner they're in the ground, the sooner they'll establish themselves." We worked together in comfortable silence, both of us enjoying the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful. Emma didn't know about my history with Robert and Stephanie, and I didn't feel the need to share it. That chapter of my life was closed. Around noon, Thomas Wellington arrived for our weekly lunch. This had become our tradition since the trials ended, a chance to catch up on news and enjoy each other's company without the weight of legal proceedings hanging over us. "You look well," he said, settling into his usual chair on the patio. "I feel well. Better than I have in years." "Any word from the federal prosecutors about the restitution case?" I nodded. "The final settlement came through yesterday. The government recovered over $2 million from the various schemes Stephanie was running. My portion was modest. They only took about $30,000 from me directly. But the symbolic value was important. And Robert? Any attempts at contact? His lawyer sent a letter last month. Robert wanted to visit, to explain himself and ask for my forgiveness. I sipped my iced tea and watched a butterfly land on my newly planted lavender. I declined. Thomas wasn't surprised. We'd discussed this possibility many times over the past months. Robert's incarceration had apparently triggered some kind of awakening to the magnitude of what he'd done, and he'd been making overtures about reconciliation through his attorney. "Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" Thomas asked. I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness was complicated when it came to family, especially when the betrayal had been so complete and calculated. "I've forgiven him in the sense that I don't carry anger around with me anymore," I said finally. The rage I felt during those first weeks after their arrest was poisoning me. I had to let it go for my own peace of mind. But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to have a relationship with him. It doesn't mean I have to trust him or welcome him back into my life. Some actions have permanent consequences. Thomas nodded approvingly. "Charles would be proud of how you've handled all of this," I hope so. I think about him every day, not with sadness anymore, but with gratitude. He protected me even after death, and he gave me the tools to reclaim my life. After Thomas left, I spent the afternoon working in the garden with Emma. We planted the new roses, weeded the vegetable beds, and discussed plans for a small greenhouse I was considering adding near the back fence. "Mrs. Hartwell," Emma said as we cleaned up our tools, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you seem like someone who's really at peace with yourself." I smiled. It took me a while to get here, but yes, I think I am. That evening, I called my old friend Susan, the friend who Robert and Stephanie had claimed moved to Florida, but who actually lived 15 minutes away and had been worried sick about me during the months when they'd been isolating me from my social contacts. "How was your day?" Susan asked. "Perfect, actually. I planted roses, had lunch with Thomas, and finished reading that mystery novel you recommended. And no unwanted visitors or phone calls." Susan still worried that Robert or Stephanie might somehow contact me from prison, or that their associates might cause trouble. But their criminal enterprise had collapsed completely when the federal investigation went public. Everyone involved had either been arrested or fled to avoid prosecution. Nothing. It's been months since anyone from that part of my life has tried to reach me. Good. You deserve your peace, Amanda. Peace. That was exactly what I had found. Not just the absence of conflict, but the positive presence of contentment, security, and purpose. I'd discovered that I enjoyed living alone, making my own decisions about everything from what to have for dinner to how to spend my afternoons. I'd joined a book club, started volunteering at the animal shelter, and even taken up watercolor painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was managing everyone else's needs and demands. The house felt like mine again in a way it hadn't for years. I'd removed all traces of Robert and Stephanie's presence, redecorated the rooms they'd changed, and filled the space with things that brought me joy, rather than things chosen by committee or compromise. More importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment again. The months of gaslighting and manipulation had made me doubt my perceptions and memories, but time and distance had restored my confidence in my own mind. I was not confused. Not forgetful, not incompetent. I was the intelligent woman with decades of life experience and the right to make my own choices about my future. That night, as I got ready for bed, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, tied to a chair, watching her life being destroyed, feeling helpless and alone. She seemed like a different person now, someone I remembered with sympathy but not identification. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been weeks of anger so intense I could barely function. Weeks of grief for the son I thought I'd raised, mourning the relationship I'd believed we had. Weeks of self-doubt, wondering if I could have done something different, something better, to prevent Robert from becoming the man who could tie his own mother to a chair. But with Thomas's guidance and the support of friends like Susan, I'd worked through those feelings and emerged stronger. I'd learned that I was not responsible for Robert's choices, that I had been a good mother who raised a son who chose to become someone I didn't recognize. More importantly, I'd learned that I was capable of starting over at 68 years old. I was capable of creating a new life, new relationships, new purposes that had nothing to do with the family role that had defined me for so many years. As I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I thought about Charles and the elaborate protections he'd created for me. He'd known something I hadn't wanted to accept, that love wasn't always enough to protect you from the people who were supposed to love you back. But he'd also given me something more valuable than legal documents and security services. He'd given me the knowledge that I was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth saving. Even when I couldn't see it myself, he'd seen my value and taken steps to preserve it. Now I could see it too. I was Amanda Hartwell, a woman who had survived betrayal and emerged victorious. I was someone who deserved respect, kindness, and the right to live her remaining years exactly as she chose. Tomorrow would bring new small pleasures. Maybe I'd drive to the farmer's market and buy fresh strawberries. Maybe I'd call Emma and discuss adding fruit trees to the garden design. Maybe I'd simply sit on my patio with a book and enjoy the fact that no one could disturb my peace unless I invited them to. The possibilities were endless, and they were all mine to choose. For the first time in my adult life, I answered to no one but myself, and that freedom, hard-won and carefully guarded, was more precious than anything Robert and Stephanie had tried to steal from me.